There are places in the world that feel haunted, not by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by the weight of a single terrible event. These are places where the soil seems to hold a memory, where the wind whistling through the trees sounds like a whisper, and where the silence is heavier than any sound. These are the crime scenes that time forgot, the historical cold case files that remain stubbornly, chillingly open, their questions echoing unanswered through the decades. Tonight we travel to one such place. We are going to a remote corner of Bavaria, in the years just after the First World War, to a small isolated farmstead that would become the setting for one of the most brutal, baffling, and creepiest unsolved mysteries in European history. This is a story that has no neat resolution, no clever detective to unmask the killer in the final act. It is a story that begins with strange whispers and footsteps in the snow, and ends in a barn, with a blood-soaked pickaxe. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, a crime so strange and so savage that it has become a cornerstone of German true crime lore. In this first part of our investigation, we will not focus on the crime itself, but on the unsettling prelude. We will get to know the family who lived on that lonely farm, the dark secrets they kept, and the mounting series of bizarre, inexplicable events that preceded the slaughter. We will walk the grounds of Hinterkaifeck in the days leading up to the end of March, 1922, and listen as the family did, to the strange sounds that signaled a gathering storm. To understand the isolation of Hinterkaifeck, you must first understand its name. In German, Hinter means behind, and Kaifeck was the name of a small hamlet, itself little more than a collection of houses, near the larger town of Weidhofen, about an hour's drive north of Munich. So, Hinterkaifeck simply meant the farm behind Kaifeck. It wasn't even its official name. It was a local nickname for a farmstead that sat about a kilometer away from anything else, surrounded by its own fields and a patch of dark woodland. It was a world unto itself. The farm was owned and run by the Gruber family. The patriarch was Andreas Gruber, a 63-year-old man known in the surrounding villages as a hard worker, but also as a difficult, domineering, and often tyrannical figure. He was respected for his success as a farmer, but he was not well liked. His wife, Kazilia, aged 72, was a frail and pious woman, largely overshadowed by her husband's powerful personality. Living with them was their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, who was 35 years old. Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel, had been a soldier in the Great War and had been reported killed in the trenches of France in 1914. Victoria was left to raise their two young children on the farm. Kazilia, named after her grandmother who was 7 years old, and Joseph, a toddler who was just 2. And it is here, with the parentage of little Joseph, that we encounter the first dark secret of Hinterkaifeck. The official story was that he was Victoria's legitimate son, but the rumors in the village told a different, more disturbing story. For years, there had been whispers about an incestuous relationship between Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria. It wasn't just idle gossip. The two had actually been convicted of incest by the local court in 1915, and had served time in prison, Andreas for a year, Victoria for a month. The community believed, with good reason, that little Joseph was not the son of Victoria's dead husband, but the product of this ongoing, illicit relationship with her own father. This grim secret cast a long dark shadow over the family, isolating them even further from their neighbors. They were a family apart, bound by a shared sin and the harsh realities of farm life. The final member of the household was the maid. This is a crucial detail. Life on a farm like Hinterkaifeck was relentlessly hard, and a maid was essential. But the Grubers had trouble keeping one. In late 1921, their previous maid had quit abruptly. She claimed the farm was haunted. She told people she heard strange whispers and footsteps in the attic, and felt a constant, unnerving presence. She fled the farm in terror and refused to return. For 6 long months, the Grubers lived on the farm without a maid. It wasn't until the very last day of March 1922 that a new one arrived. Her name was Maria Baumgartner. She was 44 years old. Her sister had dropped her off at the farm on the afternoon of Friday, March 31st. She would be dead within hours of starting her new job. So this was the household at Hinterkaifeck on that fateful Friday. The tyrannical Andreas, his wife Kazilia, their daughter Victoria, the 2 young children Kazilia and Joseph, and the brand new maid Maria. 6 people, isolated from the world, with a storm of violence about to break over their heads. The horror that was to come did not arrive without warning. In the weeks and days leading up to the murders, a series of strange and deeply unsettling events occurred, events that Andreas Gruber himself reported to his neighbors. These are not later embellishments. They are part of the historical record of the case, a slow, creeping crescendo of dread. The first incident happened about 6 months before the murders, shortly after the previous maid had fled. Andreas Gruber found a strange newspaper on his property, a copy of a Munich newspaper that he had not purchased and did not subscribe to. He couldn't understand how it had gotten there. It was a small thing, a minor anomaly, but it was the first sign that someone, a stranger, was intruding upon his isolated world. Then the events became more personal and more frightening. In the days leading up to the end of March, Andreas confided in his neighbors about a series of discoveries. The first was a set of footprints in the freshly fallen snow. They were clear, distinct footprints leading from the edge of the dark woods that bordered his property, directly to the farmhouse. He followed the tracks, expecting to find where the intruder had gone, but he found no second set of tracks leading away. It was as if someone had walked out of the forest, right up to his home, and then simply vanished. He spent hours searching the property, the barn, the sheds, but found no one. The next night, the family was tormented by strange sounds. They heard footsteps coming from the attic, above their bedrooms. Andreas, armed with his rifle, went up to investigate. The attic was empty. He searched every corner, but there was no one there. The sounds were inexplicable. The sounds the previous maid had claimed to hear. The sounds that had driven her from the farm. The strangeness continued. The very next day, a set of house keys, which had been securely put away, disappeared. They were gone without a trace. The family searched everywhere, but the keys were simply missing. A few days later, someone tried to break into the tool shed. The lock showed clear signs of tampering, scratches and marks from a tool, but the would-be intruder had failed to get in. All of these events point to a terrifying conclusion. Someone was watching the farm. Someone was living on the property or nearby, moving about at will, unseen. Someone was testing the locks, learning the layout of the farm, and tormenting the family with their hidden presence. It was a slow, deliberate campaign of psychological terror. One might ask, why didn't Andreas Gruber go to the police? It's a question that has puzzled investigators for a century. He was clearly frightened. He told several neighbors about these events, discussing them in the local pub, but he never made an official report. Perhaps his pride and his stubborn, domineering nature prevented him from admitting he needed help. Perhaps he felt that the police would not take him seriously. Or perhaps, and this is a more chilling thought, he had some idea who might be tormenting him, a secret enemy from his past, and he believed he could handle the situation himself. Whatever the reason, his failure to contact the authorities was a fatal mistake. The final bizarre clue came on Friday, March 31st, the day of the murders. A traveling coffee salesman and mechanic named Albert Hoffner arrived at Hinterkaifeck in the afternoon. He had come to repair the engine on the farm's food chopper. He spent about 4.5 hours working on the engine in the courtyard. He later told police that the farm seemed eerily quiet. He saw and spoke briefly with Victoria and her daughter, Kazilia. He heard Andreas in the barn, but the atmosphere felt tense, subdued. After he finished the repair, he left. He was one of the last people to see any of the Grubers alive. As he was leaving, he noticed that the family dog, which was usually tied up, was barking aggressively from inside the barn, a place it was not normally kept. That same afternoon, as we know, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived. The stage was now set. All 6 victims were present on the farm. The unseen tormentor, who had been living in the shadows, was about to make their move. What happened next on that cold Friday night must be pieced together from the forensic evidence found at the scene days later. The theory constructed by the police is a chilling one. They believe the killer or killers used a clever and patient lure. They waited until the evening chores were being done. One by one, 4 of the 6 victims were lured into the barn. The police speculated that perhaps the killer had untied one of the cows, and the family members went into the barn, one after another, to investigate the commotion. First to go was likely the 35-year-old Victoria, then her 7-year-old daughter Kazilia, then Victoria's mother, the elderly Kazilia Gruber, and finally the patriarch himself, Andreas Gruber. In the dim, dusty light of the barn, amidst the smell of hay and livestock, they were met not by a loose cow, but by a killer wielding a mattock, a heavy farming tool similar to a pickaxe. One by one they were struck down, their skulls crushed with unimaginable ferocity. The killer was not finished. With 4 members of the family lying dead in the barn, the murderer then entered the farmhouse itself. In her bedroom, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, was slain in her bed. Finally, in his mother's bedroom in his own cot, the 2-year-old toddler, Joseph, was also murdered. 6 people, 3 generations of a single family wiped out. And then the story takes its final, almost unbelievable turn. The killer did not flee. The evidence strongly suggests that the murderer remained on the farm for several days after the slaughter. They lived in the house, with the bodies of their victims lying just yards away in the house and barn. They tended to the livestock, feeding the cows and the chickens. They ate food from the kitchen, slicing meat from the pantry. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the farm's chimney over the weekend. The dog continued to be fed and cared for. It is an act of such cold, calm audacity that it almost defies comprehension. The killer had not just murdered the family. They had taken over their lives, inhabiting their home like a ghost. For 4 long days the outside world knew nothing. It wasn't unusual for the Grubers, an isolated and unsociable family, to keep to themselves. But by Saturday, People started to notice their absence. Young Kazilia did not show up for school. On Sunday, the entire family was absent from their customary place at church. This was highly unusual for the pious Kazilia Gruber Sr. and her daughter Victoria. The postman, Joseph Mayer, noticed that the mail he had delivered on Saturday was still untouched on Monday. A repairman, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who had a close and complex relationship with the family, sent his son to the farm to see if anyone was home, but he returned having found no one. Finally, on Tuesday, April 4th, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, accompanied by 2 other men from the village, decided to investigate. The farm was eerily silent. The doors were locked. They peered through a window into the barn. What they saw in the gloom would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They broke into the barn, and there they found the first 4 bodies, piled together and partially covered with hay. In a state of shock and horror, they then entered the farmhouse, where they found the bodies of the maid and the little boy. The Hinterkaifeck murders had been discovered. The tiny rural community was plunged into a state of terror. The police were called from Munich, a full 60 miles away. The investigation began, but it was flawed from the very start. The crime scene was a chaotic mess. Before the official investigators arrived, dozens of neighbors and local villagers had tramped through the house and barn, disturbing evidence, moving objects and contaminating the scene with countless fingerprints and footprints. This initial chaos would cripple the investigation for good. The scene that greeted the Munich detectives was one of almost unimaginable brutality. The autopsies, conducted in the barn itself by Dr. Johann Baptist Aumler, confirmed that all 6 victims had been killed by massive blunt force trauma to the head, inflicted by a mattock. The mattock itself was found in the barn, covered in blood. It belonged to the Gruber family. The weapon had come from the farm itself. The autopsies also revealed some deeply disturbing details. Little Kazilia, the 7-year-old girl, had not died instantly. She had survived for several hours after the initial attack, lying in the hay next to the bodies of her mother and grandparents. In her terror and agony, she had torn out clumps of her own hair. The brutality of the killings, the strange events leading up to them, and the bizarre behavior of the killer afterwards, created a perfect storm of mystery. Who could have done this? And why? The investigation would span decades, consider over 100 suspects, and generate countless theories, but it would never find a definitive answer. The unsolved farm murders of Hinterkaifeck would become a permanent, bleeding wound in the memory of the region. In the second part of our story, we will delve into that flawed investigation. We will examine the main suspects, from jilted lovers to shadowy figures from the family's past. We will explore the strange psychological theories that have emerged. And we will confront the chilling possibility that, after 100 years, the identity of the monster of Hinterkaifeck may finally be within our grasp. Welcome back to our investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders. In part 1, we explored the isolated world of the Gruber family, and the series of strange, menacing events that culminated in their slaughter on the night of March 31, 1922. We left the story on Tuesday, April 4th, with the discovery of the 6 bodies, a community plunged into terror, and a crime scene that defied all logic. Now, in part 2, we delve into the aftermath. We will follow the flawed and frustrating police investigation, as it uncovers a web of secrets, lies, and local enmities. We will examine the gallery of suspects, from the obvious to the obscure, and weigh the evidence for and against them. And we will explore the haunting theories, both psychological and paranormal, that have grown up around this historical cold case in the century since it happened. This is a journey into the heart of one of Europe's most notorious unsolved farm murders. A search for a killer who, after committing an act of unimaginable brutality, seemed to simply vanish from the face of the earth. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders was led by Chief Inspector George Reingruber and his team from the Munich Police Department. From the moment they arrived, they were faced with an almost impossible task. The crime scene, as we noted, had been hopelessly compromised. Villagers had handled the bodies, moved the murder weapon, and even sat down in the kitchen to eat and drink while waiting for the police. The concept of forensic science was in its infancy, and what little evidence might have existed was likely destroyed in those first chaotic hours. Despite these challenges, the investigators began to piece together a picture of the crime. The choice of weapon off farm tool belonging to the Grubers suggested the killer had not come prepared to commit murder, or at least had not brought their own weapon. The method of luring the victims into the barn one by one suggested a killer who was patient, cunning, and familiar with the routines of farm life. And the fact that the killer remained on the farm for days afterwards suggested a level of cold-blooded composure that was almost inhuman. The initial motive appeared to be robbery. Victoria Gabriel was known to keep a significant amount of cash in the house, the proceeds from selling farm goods. A large sum of gold marks was indeed found to be missing. However, the robbery theory quickly began to crumble. A significant amount of other valuables, including jewelry and more cash, had been left untouched, in plain sight. It seemed that if robbery was the motive, it was a secondary one. The sheer savage brutality of the killing spoke not of a simple theft gone wrong, but of a deep personal rage. This was a crime of passion, of revenge. The investigation therefore turned away from transient thieves and towards people who knew the Gruber family. And the list of potential suspects, each with their own compelling motive, began to grow. The first, and for a long time the most prominent suspect, was the neighbor who had led the search party, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Schlittenbauer's relationship with the Gruber family, and specifically with Victoria Gabriel, was deeply complicated. He was a widower who had been having an affair with Victoria for some time. In fact, he was widely believed in the village to be the true father of the murdered toddler, Joseph. He had even signed the boy's birth certificate as the father and was paying maintenance for him. His motive seemed clear: a crime of passion. Perhaps he and Victoria had a violent argument. Perhaps he was enraged by her ongoing incestuous relationship with her father, Andreas. Perhaps he wanted Victoria to leave the farm and marry him, and she refused. His behavior on the day the bodies were discovered was also highly suspicious. He was one of the first to enter the scene, and witnesses reported that he handled the bodies, potentially disturbing evidence. Some even claimed he seemed oddly unsurprised by the gruesome discovery. The case against Schlittenbauer was strong enough that he was arrested and interrogated at length. But he had an alibi. Several people confirmed he was in the local pub on the night of the murders, and no direct evidence ever linked him to the crime. He was eventually released. For the rest of his life, he was a man under a cloud of suspicion. On his deathbed years later, he reportedly made a final ambiguous confession, saying he had made a great sin at Hinterkaifeck, but he died before he could elaborate. To this day, many amateur investigators believe Lorenz Schlittenbauer was the killer. The second major suspect was a man who wasn't even supposed to be alive. Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband. As we know, Karl Gabriel was officially listed as killed in action in France in 1914. His body was never recovered, but that was not unusual in the chaos of trench warfare. However, a persistent rumor refused to die, that Karl Gabriel had not been killed. The story went that he had survived the war, had been taken prisoner by the Russians, and had eventually made his way back to Germany, only to find his wife had given birth to a child that was not his. This theory provides a powerful motive: the rage of a betrayed husband. A soldier, brutalized by years of war, returning home to find his wife in an incestuous relationship with her father and raising another man's child. It is a recipe for explosive violence. Some people even came forward after the murders, claiming to have met a Russian-speaking German soldier in the region who was asking for directions to Hinterkaifeck. After the Second World War, some German prisoners of war returning from Soviet gulags even claimed to have met a fellow prisoner who boasted of having killed his entire family back in Bavaria. But these stories are all secondhand, impossible to verify. No concrete evidence has ever surfaced to prove that Karl Gabriel survived the war. The ghosts of the trenches remained ghosts. The investigation then cast its net wider, looking at other local figures with a grudge against the domineering Andreas Gruber. Andreas was known to be a litigious and unpleasant man, and he had made enemies. There were disputes over land, over money, over perceived slights. The police investigated several local men, including two brothers, Adolf and Anton Gump, who were suspected of being part of a local robbery gang, and were known to have a feud with Gruber. But again, a lack of evidence meant no charges could ever be brought. The case grew cold. Years turned into decades. The farmstead of Hinterkaifeck was torn down in 1923, the year after the murders, as if the community wanted to erase the physical scar from their landscape. The memory, however, proved harder to demolish. In the years since, the Hinterkaifeck murders have become a national obsession in Germany, a true crime legend that has spawned countless books, documentaries, and websites. And with this renewed interest have come new, more modern theories. One of the most compelling recent investigations was undertaken in 2007 by students at the Police Academy in Fürstenfeldbruck. As a cold case project, they re-examined all the original evidence using modern investigative techniques. While they did not solve the crime, they did come to a consensus on a single prime suspect. They have never publicly named this person, out of respect for their living relatives, but their conclusion has reinvigorated the debate. Many believe they pointed the finger squarely back at Lorenz Schlittenbauer, suggesting his alibi was not as solid as it first appeared. Other theories have delved into the psychological profile of the killer. The bizarre act of staying on the farm for days after the murders has led some to suggest the killer was not just a man in a fit of rage, but a genuine psychopath, someone completely devoid of empathy or remorse. The pre-crime stalking, the footprints, the strange noises, the missing key suggests a predator toying with his prey. This profile could fit an unknown transient, a drifter with a history of violence who just happened upon the isolated farm. This is in some ways the most terrifying theory of all, that the murders were a random act, a collision of a vulnerable family and a passing monster. And of course, no mystery this strange would be complete without a paranormal explanation. The story told by the first maid off the farm being haunted, of hearing footsteps and whispers, has never been forgotten. Some believe that the farm itself was a place of evil, and that the killer was driven by some supernatural force. While this is outside the realm of police investigation, it speaks to the profound sense of unease that the case generates, a feeling that the events at Hinterkaifeck were so far outside the bounds of normal human behavior that they must have an otherworldly explanation. So where does that leave us? We are left with a constellation of suspects, a web of theories, and a profound lack of certainty. Was it the jealous lover, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, driven to madness by a toxic love triangle? Was it the ghost of a dead husband, returned from the war to exact a terrible revenge? Was it a local enemy of the family, settling a score with brutal finality? Or was it a faceless stranger, a psychopath who wandered out of the dark woods and into the Gruber's worst nightmare? The truth is, we will likely never know for sure. The physical evidence is long gone. The witnesses are all dead. The secrets of that bloody night in March 1922 are kept by the 6 souls buried in the Weidhofen cemetery, under a single shared headstone. The enduring fascination with the Hinterkaifeck murders lies in this very lack of resolution. It is a perfect unsolved circle. It is a story that forces us to look into the abyss, to confront the fact that sometimes, the most horrific acts of violence have no clear motive, and the perpetrators are never brought to justice. It is a stark reminder from a not-so-distant past that the quiet, isolated corners of the world can sometimes be the most dangerous places of all, and that the darkest secrets are often the ones kept within a family. The creepiest unsolved mysteries are not the ones with complex clues, but the ones with a terrifying simple brutality that leaves behind nothing but silence. And the silence at Hinterkaifeck is deafening. Thank you for listening to this investigation of the Hinterkaifeck murders. Which theory do you find most compelling? Do you believe the killer was someone the family knew? Or a complete stranger? Share your own insights and theories in the comments section below. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most chilling cold cases compelling, please consider subscribing and sharing our channel. Your support allows us to continue to shine a light on these forgotten tragedies. Until next time, sleep well.